Hello and welcome to the Cyber Hub Network, a network that aims to provide informed conversations about cybersecurity latest trends, latest threats, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, latest solutions to the problems that you face every day dealing with cybersecurity. Now, in the last roundtable that we had, which was on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, we discussed multiple things about artificial intelligence, and we ended up discussing about the risks that artificial intelligence poses to cybersecurity, and we ended up talking about the importance of cyber insurance. Now, cyber insurance can be a little tricky to understand. I'm not going to lie, it might have been complicated to understand for myself at first, probably because it's very intangible. We are used to talking about insurance when we're talking about our houses, our cars, our businesses, the liability, all of that. But how do we ensure cybersecurity? And most importantly, what does this mean for the organization that is going to have to deal with this? So to answer some of these very important questions, today we have two excellent panelists who are joining us remotely to have the conversation. So we have, coming in from the US, Max Bobys, Vice President Hudson. Hi, Max.
Hello.
Very nice to have you with us today.
Same. I appreciate the opportunity to accompany you guys today.
Thank you. And also we have with us Chris Bhatt, Transport and Logistics Leader for the MENA region and on CCO Specialty MENA, Aon Reinsurance Solution MENA Limited. Hi Chris, and sorry for the title, it's a bit long.
Yeah, sorry. I'll try and get a shorter title for the next session. Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation, Alex.
It's a pleasure to have you both. Thank you for joining. Chris, you're joining from Dubai as well. So it is a truly international roundtable today, as I'm based in Paris. So to start our conversation today, I think I would like to understand a little bit better from you, Max. What does this mean? When we're talking about cyber insurance and businesses at large, what does it mean?
Well, that is the $1,000,000 question, or euro question, or pound question.
Quite literally, in fact.
And literally. And I think what it means is, inherently, is that it requires a conversation between a number of different stakeholders in an organization that oftentimes don't necessarily come together in a collaborative fashion. And so what insurance does is it forces different stakeholders to come together in a conversation that challenges many people who are not what I would call the frontline practitioners on managing cyber risks for their organizations. And so I like to take a step back and look at things a little bit more broadly at first, or put it in context. When we talk about physical security risks, they're tangible. You can see a threat coming at you, to be crude. With cyber, it challenges people's concepts of space, time, context, attribution. They don't know who's coming at them. They don't know when they're doing it, why they're doing it, or even how they're doing it. And so when we talk about cyber risk, you're bringing people together who often wind up talking past each other in the organization. They speak a different language. And so I tend to look at this, the cyber risk transfer conversation fundamentally as one of language. It's one of collaboration. It's one of education, and that's where it really starts. What happens oftentimes is that you get technical people going right into the conversation about tooling, and they skip the discussion about, well, what is appropriate? What are the appropriate resources within our business to manage cyber risk? Resources being people, processes, tools, and money. So there's an inherent, almost like a default initiation where, okay, cyber, that's the IT guy or gal's problem, or that's the chief information security officer's problem. That's not my problem. And to break down those barriers requires a strategy, an approach that facilitates dialogue, facilitates a transformation of I like to review it as a transformation of consciousness to a certain extent about getting people to participate on the same field with the same vocabulary, talking through these things in a business fashion, because at the end of the day, we want to break down the conversation in terms of money. That's the common denominator. And once you're able to establish those paradigms for collaboration, for language, then those are what I call the antecedents to a more informed conversation around cyber risk transfer. And I can go on and on and on, but that's how I like to think about it. And so sometimes those challenges can be difficult, and sometimes it requires maybe a third party coming in to help facilitate those discussions to preempt any internal politics or things like that. So that's how I like to think about it.
So yeah, if I'm understanding this correctly, then we're talking about quite often in organizations, it can be quite siloed, and it can be that they don't necessarily, these different business lines, business units don't necessarily talk to each other. And there might not also be a sense that a cybersecurity incident might happen in a unit, but would impact everyone. Is that sort of correct?
Absolutely, and I'm going to start creeping into Chris's space from the insurance side. So I like to think of things in terms of from a cyber threat landscape. Every organization, and this is almost cliche at this point in time, every organization is not only vulnerable to cyber, but has either experienced a cyber incident or will experience a cyber incident. And really, what it comes down to is how robust, how resilient is that organization in the face of an ever and fast evolving, persistent threat environment, and increasingly complex attack surface. And what do I mean? Just a quick segue about what do I mean by attack surface. What I mean is the complexities that are being introduced into organizations with cloud services, with operational technologies, increasingly outsourced services that involve integration with the information technology team, and now with the introduction and expansion of Internet of Things technologies, remote access, machine learning, and of course, artificial intelligence. All these things come together and impact different aspects of the organization and the individuals that operate within that organization in different ways. And one of the hardest things, and at the risk of maybe going out of the swim lane here, is that when we talk about cyber risk, it's actually a threat and a risk that organizations need to teach their employees to understand that they actually take it home with them. And it cascades out to encompass their trust relationships in their families. And so it's an environment that is unlike any threat environment in effect in human history. So these challenges come back down into the organization where, again, you have these individuals collaborating, dependent on one another. And the big thing that I like to focus in initially on is how readily prepared are they to respond to an incident. And so pre-breach preparation, the planning involved with incident response or activities, and then recovery actions from there are so important. And the insurance companies that we work with, whether on the broking side or on the underwriting side, incident response is near the top of the list in terms of evaluating an organization's ability in terms of cyber resilience.
So, okay, I'll come to Chris in a second to understand a bit more how he ties in and how insurance ties into all this. But just before I do that, I want to fully understand, Max. So you come in to sort of talk to everyone in the organization and bring them together around this topic of cybersecurity. That's correct, yes?
It is. Yeah. Can I expand on that real quick?
Yes, you might. Yeah.
Sure. So I look at the cyber risk conversation prior to the insurance conversation as one of a change management activity, or as they used to say in the old days, business process reengineering, and getting people around the same table to understand, okay, what are the objectives of the organization? Are there commitments what are the internal objectives with staff? What are the objectives with third parties? Third parties being vendors and suppliers, as well as customers and regulators and other organizations like your underwriter and your broker. How robust, what are the communication mechanisms in place to facilitate that dialogue? And then work through the prejudices, the preconceived ideas of what cyber security is, who's responsible for it, who needs to take action, and break some of those barriers down in a collaborative fashion in order to have a meaningful conversation about risk transfer. So yes, to come back, Alex, to your point, yeah, we come in oftentimes either as a pre-binding discussion to help those organizations prepare for an informed dialogue with their brokers and underwriters, or we sometimes come in as a post-binding benefit to the client as a risk reduction activity.
Okay, so as I said, moving on to Chris for a minute. Chris, where do you fit into all this? What does this all mean for cyber insurance?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And Max articulates that part of the conversation really well. And if you think about insurance as being a means of, protecting your assets, you really need to go through a number of stages in order to get to the point where you buy insurance. So very crudely, we would say you need to quantify your potential loss, right? So understand what the loss might be to the business, whether that's, financial or other. Then you look at all the different ways internally within a business that you can avoid that loss, right? Mitigating that risk. And then when you've done all that, and you could liken it to like a health and safety campaign at work, shut that door, don't leave that extension lead on the floor, don't trip over that. All that stuff, that's all about mitigating risk, right? It's about avoiding risk within a business. Once you've done all that, you then get to a point where you say, look, there's this amount that we can't get rid of by virtue of better processes or better techniques internally. So that's the bit that you then think about transferring. And you can do one of two things. You can transfer it to your balance sheet. You can run the risk internally and say, look, if the worst happens, we'll pay because we can afford to be exposed to that amount of money. Or you use the insurance industry as a means of accepting that financial loss on your behalf, right? You pay a premium, you get cover in the event of a claim. The cover pays out. So our role is, I think, our role quite rightly is sort of all the way through the process, linking very closely to what Max is saying at the beginning, where you're helping the business to understand, what are they facing here? To his point about, the assailant is often unseen. You can't. It's not obvious. So we're kind of there, but really our role is at the back end in terms of, from an insurance perspective, is just, getting that right, the last bit of the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, of providing that backstop. And Alex, the key, as with all insurance, you don't buy insurance to have a shiny policy on your desk or in your file. You buy it so that in the event of an incident, you get your claim paid, right? And of course, so that's the issue here. It's all about making sure the business has done enough to protect itself before you go and buy the insurance. Don't do it the other way around. That's our kind of message always to people. So.
Right. So what I'm understanding then is that we have companies like Max's that will come in and will work with organizations to understand what the lay of the land is in the organization, how it works, how cybersecurity, what the issues may be, what the risks may be, and then trying to address them by by pulling everyone together and not just putting the onus of dealing with this on one individual or one department. And then we come into the risk that is left comes into the cybersecurity insurance, where we're saying, okay, I do not know what to do with this risk, so I'm going to be insuring it. Am I getting this right?
Absolutely, that's exactly our role. And again, in an ideal scenario, that process is repeated constantly, because it's not a tick box exercise where you can say, well, we've achieved this standard, therefore we can tick a box and walk away, and and therefore everything's fine. Because of course, as Max will quite rightly point out, the threat evolves all the time. So you can't just say it's all done and dusted and we're fine. Okay, it's something that needs to be constantly monitored, constantly looked at.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions I had for you both really was the fact that, and you sort of alluded to it right there. I mean, you're talking about the fact that cybersecurity threats evolve quite fast. Max also mentioned the fact that you don't always know that you might be the target or that you're being targeted. But I think also, and I've heard this before in conversations in different fields, quite a variety of fields, there's this sense also that I have the money, I'm just going to throw money at the problem and I'll just be fine. Is that something that you're also encountering sometimes in your business? And you're both smiling and nodding. So Max, go ahead.
Sure. How much time do we have? So yeah, that risks, at the end of that premise, it risks moral hazard, right? I'm throwing money at this, therefore I don't have to do anything else. But let's go to the beginning of that conversation. Once we are working with a client, one of the things that always strikes me is how often there appears to be a disconnect between buyers and sellers. And I'm not talking about vendors and buyers in the market. What I'm referring to are the individuals within an organization who are the buyers, often those responsible for the cybersecurity program. Sorry, the sellers, I got that backwards. The sellers are the ones in the cybersecurity program who are responsible for that program. The buyers are those in charge of the purse strings. And again, it comes back to talking past each other. And one of the ways that I'm always struck by is how, especially in the smaller to medium-sized businesses, where there isn't an informed discussion around something that Chris alluded to regarding the loss scenarios, the quantification of potential exposures, and why is that important? Because when you get people who are responsible for different areas in the business or the organization that ultimately impact the ability of that organization to function and render services to their clients, whether it's a port authority or a terminal operator or a manufacturer or a retailer, these challenges come up where there might be preconceived ideas of what we should invest in terms of risk transfer. But then when you drill down into it and you get collaboration about, okay, how does a breach in the IT environment affect operations? How does it affect our ability to work with our vendors or our customers? And then you start facilitating that back and forth. And then you can come to an informed conclusion around what is the value at risk in terms of a specific event, like a ransomware event or a wiper event, like what happened with NotPetya in 2017. And so then once you develop these scenarios and you actually put figures against them, well, now you're starting to have an informed conversation about quantifying that risk, which does what? It establishes that common denominator in the conversations between the buyers and sellers. And then they can determine in a more not only collaborative way, but in a more informed way to reach decisions about what types of insurance cover to, not only the types of insurance cover to secure, but what retentions might be most appropriate for that organization.
Is there
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. Chris, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add, there's a C word as well, the culture. And I think that if you look at statistics, I think 5 years ago, Max and I would say, that something like 60% of all breaches occur because of human behavior, whether deliberate or accidental. I don't think that statistic has changed in the last 5 years. So there's this cultural piece that needs to be looked at very carefully within any organization. And I think the organizations that get it right have that really smart link between the chief information security teams, whatever name they want to give them, and the HR from a human perspective. And that I think that link and that development of that culture is so important. And listen, the insurers 5 years ago were less interested in that part of an organization, but now they're much more interested in what's going on inside the business, aside from the obvious, have you got these basic levels of security in place. They also want to understand a lot more about what the business is doing from a cultural perspective, which is the right behavior in my opinion.
And I'd like to add something to that, actually. Chris touches on something that isn't focused enough on in industry in the cybersecurity conversations. So, for example, in cyber, there are different frameworks and standards. For example, you have the ISO 27001 standard. You have the NIST cybersecurity framework that was just updated last year. You have other best practices as promulgated by the Center for Internet Security. They're critical controls. All these things are very good, and they inform the governance and implementation of cybersecurity capabilities within the organization. But to Chris's point, there is a culture that permeates the implementation of all of that, and that is sometimes very hard to tease out of an organization. For example, you could sit with a CISO and they could bring all this good information to the table in terms of key performance metrics and other statistics in terms of how many threats they've prevented from getting through the firewalls, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if there are cultural aspects that are loose on the social media front, for example, well, that is a very human forum for interacting, and that is a target-rich environment for threat actors to gain information about individuals. And so culture is it's a softer, more subtle thing to assess, and so to that point, we actually look at it from a cybersecurity maturity perspective, right, which tries to tease out beyond the standards and frameworks. The standards and frameworks are, don't get me wrong, they're necessary and they're appropriate, but they're not the end all in the final evaluation of an organization's cyber risk profile.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add to that point about culture.
No, it's important. And I think this is where I wanted to tie in a little bit also the conversation that we had, as I mentioned, the previous roundtable that we did, where we talked about artificial intelligence. And one of the main points that they made in terms of what can be done was very much about culture in an organization and governance and training people to understand what the risks are. And I think one of the questions I had for you both really was, Chris, you mentioned the fact that, we're saying that, I don't remember the statistic exactly anymore, but there's a certain percentage of all of the cybersecurity incidents that happen that have to do with the human factor. And you said this has probably not changed that much. And I'm thinking, why not? We've been doing so much awareness. There's been even as a normal citizen who doesn't, I work for myself, right? So I don't even necessarily have someone there to tell me what to do and not to do yet. I have heard of what are the basics. So why are the culture not changing?
Max, maybe I'll just start, but and my comment's probably quite a broad brush approach to the global cybersecurity environment. And I suspect if you drill down into certain industries, they might be more mature again, as opposed to others that are less mature. But I think, I think that still rings quite true overall. But, I think the companies that we talk to, companies that exist around the world, are often, bound by local regulation, geopolitics, the intricate supply chain links, and so their ability to maneuver quickly is quite hampered. And I think Max has used this, so I'm stealing a phrase he uses, but the threat actors are generally limited only by their imagination. And so I think that's a problem. The insurance industry will keep up, right? So the industry has matured enormously since this became an issue, cyber security, and the product that the insurance industry as a whole delivers is much better than it ever was, and we need the customers to kind of embrace that sense of maturity with their own internal mechanisms, if you like, and recognize that it's not a simple purchase of we just need $10 million of cover, without that kind of science behind the decision. And most times, companies will say to us, we can't afford it. It's a new spend. We've got budget, for the insurances we currently have. This is new, and we haven't got the budget for it. And it's a bit trite to say, hope is not a strategy, but some people are literally, looking at their organization saying, well, look, we've done the IT piece, and hopefully, that should be sufficient. And so, I think for us, it's just trying to elevate that conversation a bit more to say, the insurance may not cost as much as you think it might, but equally, how much do you really need? Back to my point at the beginning, what are you buying insurance for? And it's amazing the conversations we have with customers and potential customers about the rationale for them looking at a particular level of insurance, and some of it's less sophisticated than you would imagine, right? And so that's, again, back to my earlier point. If you can, look at the reasons for buying it, I think, I may have said this, and if I haven't, the vast majority of incidents of cyber breaches result in very little or no damage to anything. So the assets of a company are not being damaged, but the business is being interrupted. So it's that interruption of the business operation that is the event, right? The insurable event. And so that's the area that companies need to focus on. And if their ability to recover from an incident is rapid and fast and robust, then that business interruption, the interruption might be really small in terms of a number. So therefore the amount of insurance they might need to purchase might be a lot less than they think. What we tend to find is, because there's there's an insurance maturity within an organization, they may say, look, we've got 10, 15 hotels and they're valued at this much money in the event of damage to the buildings, and therefore we want to replicate that from an insurance perspective for cyber. Because the reality is you don't need that. It's unlikely you'd need that.
Right.
So I think that's that relative lack of sophistication, I think, in the thinking, again, goes back to the cultural piece I mentioned earlier. But I think that's where I'd suggest the mindsets haven't moved on a lot in that time. Max, thoughts?
Completely agree on everything you said, Chris. I think what's interesting is, and I'm going to preface what I'm about to say, is that one of the things I've learned is that the insurance markets are actually innovative. They're looking at creating different products to meet the needs of the clients on cyber risk. And so there's different tools, there's different solutions out there from a risk transfer perspective that are being introduced, and sometimes they don't work. Sometimes they work beautifully. What is interesting about the human factor is, not that long ago, we used to have something called advanced persistent threats, APTs. And an APT, think of it as like a well-planned, well-thought-out, deliberative attack against a targeted individual or organization. And it takes time and resources for the threat actors to effect those attacks. And the intent is to maintain access and persistent access once they've gained a presence. With the introduction of AI, you now have threat actors with the ability to effect APT attacks at scale and at speed. And one of the things I do when I train is I ask the question, who's been hacked? very few people raise their hand. Nobody wants to admit it. It's sort of like there's a shame stigma attached to it, which I think is part of the problem. And then what I do is I fall on the sword and I try to explain, let me count the ways I've been compromised. And so I go through a litany of all the different organizations that I use as a customer for their services, whether it's Netflix or a healthcare provider or some other service, my credit cards, my various credit cards. And I think my count right now is up to over 20 organizations where my data has been compromised. Wow. And so it's about trying to explain to the individuals in organizations that you can't just think of cyber threats as something that's just limited to your place of employment. And this is where the personal starts to creep into the professional and vice versa. And so that thinking, I should say, has to be brought into a way of thinking, into a culture about continuous improvement, continuous analysis, and to create the muscle memory of assessing, understanding what you have, understanding what your crown jewels are, understanding where your risks are and where your vulnerabilities are, to inform the conversation around risk transfer. And it's not something that you just do once and walk away from. It's constant. It's, with fire, like, right? I mean, one of the things, when you walk into a building these days, you have what? You have smoke detectors, fire alarms, fire extinguishers. And over time, the insurance industry has driven a lot of these best practices to reduce the risk of fire inside buildings. Cyber risk, on the other hand, is like having people standing outside your building with flamethrowers all day long. And so it's about taking precautions to inform how to think about managing the risks therein. And it's not to create a sense of panic, but it's really about explaining to those in decision-making positions that cyber risk is a peril that can be managed. And what I find is, managing that risk is not just about tooling, but it's about the human factor. It's about processes. It's about the allocation of funding, which sets the stage for the conversation around cyber risk transfer.
And Max, I think you do make a good point around the insurance industry being seen as an enabler, because I do think that's one of the benefits the industry can bring to the cyber conundrum is this enablement, through subtly demanding a kind of greater maturity, risk maturity within an organization before they look at a potential customer for that risk transfer piece. So I think that's a good place that the industry likes to be, and would like to say it operates under.
Yeah, and I think
and I think what
sorry. Go ahead, Max.
No, just one final point around where Chris was going. The misperception that cybersecurity is an IT function. Well, managing cyber risk is really a balance sheet responsibility. And again, going full circle back to the common denominator of money, because I think, to Chris's point, the insurance industry is a driver of cybersecurity maturity because it forces the conversation into one that ultimately informs how to manage risk to the balance sheet. And I think that's a very positive thing.
Yeah, and I think I like what you mentioned, Max. I mean, both of you, in terms of what I'm getting, and there's a parallel again with the AI in cybersecurity roundtable, in the sense that there's really this importance to understand that it's across the organization, and it's what you're doing at home as much as what you're doing at work, and it's your behavior in general, and it's your behavior within the organization. Now, what I'm also understanding from what you're saying is that there's this sense of a lot of people don't quite grasp that, and I think it was you, Chris, who said that it's not just, if there's a break-in in your house, then your valuables are gone, and that's pretty much where the story ends. Whereas if there's a breach of cybersecurity in your organization, it could be that you think that the ransom was where it ends, but really your data is out there. Something may have happened to your data. There may be ripple effects later on your business, or at longer or shorter or medium term. So I'm thinking that both of you have a lot of work to do in terms of educating and bringing the maturity of your customers in understanding this much longer term effects. And I believe this is what you mean by risk as well, when you're trying to evaluate the risk of cybersecurity and therefore after that insurance. It's trying to understand, yes, the longer term effects, the ripple effects, and who is impacted by this.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of scenario planning that companies need to go through. And I think Max's point he made earlier about you don't know the nature of your assailant, right? So you have the threat actors that are out there, so you don't know when you're breached if it's a breach that is going to deny your ability to operate, or whether actually they're just going to sit there quietly in the background harvesting data that they're going to come back and and try and sell back to you, if you like, before they release it elsewhere. So from our perspective, we want to protect the organization once they've done all of that work around identifying what those risks are. And yes, it is a largely financial conundrum, financial decision that a company will make is this amount of insurance costs this amount of money, right? That's the broad risk transfer debate. And there are a number of different ways, as Max said, that the insurance industry is innovating to develop the offerings that it has for that cyber security. But again, the other part of it, the understanding which type of threats there are and what you do about it, that very much comes down to the assessment piece again, which Max and his team and others in the industry would help solve or help address.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Max,
Sorry,
do you
Max.
want to add something?
Yeah, I think it comes down to also training.
Mm-hmm.
And there's different types of training. And I think nowadays, the analysts in the security operations centers, whether you outsource it or whether you have it in-house, they're overwhelmed by alerts.
Mm-hmm.
So you have something called alert fatigue. I think what we're starting to see in organizations is training under the auspices of phishing fatigue. And I think there's starting to be a perception that is being fostered in the market that phishing phishing as a training tool is sufficient in and of itself for people to garner awareness of how they should manage their cyber risk profiles. Don't get me wrong. Phishing tools are excellent ways of driving home awareness because phishing is a key entry point for threat actors to get into an organization and compromise an individual. So there's definitely a place for that. But I think there is the risk now that is being created that is sufficient. And so I think around the preparation around incident response is key. Executives and senior management need to understand what their roles are when an incident does occur, because the last thing you want to be doing when an incident happens is Googling how to respond to an incident. That is not what you want. And so I think there's increasingly, well, especially among the insurers and brokers, there's an acceptance that an organization is going to be hit at some point. The question is how robust, how resilient is that organization in its ability to respond to and recover from that incident. So a plan is the first step, but you also have to exercise that plan. And so training individuals around how that plan is implemented, making sure those individuals know what their roles are, what their responsibilities are when an incident is declared. And if you need to move to an out of bounds type communication protocol, something as simple as moving to WhatsApp or personal emails or other sets of email structures. These are all critical that you want to have at least an understanding of that before the incident actually occurs. So training is a key part to the assessment activity and insurance activity. So.
And I think also, and I can't remember if it was you, Max, or if it was Chris who said it, but when we're talking about these organizations that need to improve their maturity in terms of cybersecurity, but also that means improving the processes, that means improving the understanding of like everything around a cybersecurity incident. Chris, I'm thinking, yes, people might think that cyber insurance could be costly, partly because maybe they don't fully understand what it means, as we've been saying, but also actually you are enabling, in a way, as you said, that the business is getting better through this process. You're enabling a certain way of doing business that is more secure and therefore less vulnerable and therefore, continues to make more money.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I continue to liken it to a health and safety regime within an organization, okay, so I think if you look at the way that companies over the last 30, 40 years have evolved their health and safety cultures within the workplace, that often is driven by HR. It has a very clear link to the insurances that the company will procure. And the way that the insurance industry reacts to those requests for insurance, right, based on that culture internally. And I think that's what we're looking for. And we sort of, I think, want to try and, in a gentle way, small f rather than capital F, is force the companies out there to develop that cyber maturity internally. And again, if the insurance product can be an enabler to do that, then I think that's a good thing for everybody, because let's be honest, the insurance industry doesn't want to have a huge claims incidents.
Of course.
The companies themselves don't want to have claims, so therefore it's in everyone's interests to get this other piece right, the other part of the jigsaw puzzle right. And in this we're highly interconnected world, right? And no matter what governments around the world are currently undertaking in terms of their protectionist strategies, but fundamentally the world has never been more connected. It's never been more global, and these risks fall along with that. They are highly interconnected risks. They evolve fast, and it's our job to kind of keep up with that. Companies look at supply chain risks. Companies have bigger and bigger and longer and more complicated supply chains in order to deliver a product. And of course, keeping up with all the different requests and demands of those individual suppliers all the way down that supply chain can be really difficult. So it's that demand of culture that would be, in my mind, is such a key thing.
Yeah, clearly. Max, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think there's a misperception among buyers inside the organizations where they think if they can buy a tool or some capability, then that's all that's necessary.
Yeah.
I think the reality is that you can never drive cyber risk to zero. The only way you can drive cyber risk to zero is if you don't function, you deliberately make a conscious decision to not function in the world. So you can completely disconnect, and that will drive your risk to relatively to zero. But that doesn't work for almost all organizations participating in the global economy, as Chris mentioned, with the increasing complexities that we're all dealing with. So at some point, there has to be a decision made about what's good enough for the business or for the organization, for their risk profile. So, for example, if you're a small, maybe a 30-person company with an office environment, and you're not manufacturing anything, you're not really participating in things like an operational technology-enabled world, that's one risk profile. But if you're ExxonMobil, your risk profile is completely different. And so what works for you doesn't necessarily apply to, a smaller organization. It seems obvious, But at the end of the day, the conversations are the same. You don't necessarily need to drive risk to zero as long as you have the resources in place to drive it to a point where you can start having an informed conversation about transferring that risk off your balance sheet. Same goes for ExxonMobil's of the world, where maybe some of that risk is taken off your balance sheet through purchasing insurance or perhaps setting up self-insurance mechanisms. But those, again, those are financial conversations, whether you're the largest organizations in the world or you're some of the smaller ones.
Yes, so I'm really getting this sense of the conversation going in this way, basically, that, you know, there is a cybersecurity risk, there's nothing we can do about this, but there's a way to reach a certain cybersecurity maturity that allows you to then understand what that risk really is, where do you need to transfer that little bit of risk that you cannot manage even by training your people, that it will always happen. But then it may not end up costing as much as you thought it would cost. And then in the end, it's actually not only are you protected from a cybersecurity point of view with your insurance, but also you are in the process also learning to be a more agile, I want to say also, and with better processes organization. So I think sadly we're coming to the end of our conversation today. I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time, but before concluding, I would like to, in fact, leave you, both of you, the chance to have concluding words. If there's one thought that you would like our audience to go away with today, what would it be?
Chris, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would say if you're watching this as a CISO or other technology-oriented employee, link always with your HR team. The internal connectivity of a business is the key to developing a more mature attitude towards cyber insurance. That the insurers will always, reward you for that connectivity in the product they deliver.
Max?
Sure, and I'll add to that. And so I would suggest if you are a CEO or a CISO or any kind of C-suite individual, finance, operations, facilitate an informed dialogue between your risk manager or whomever in your organization is responsible for acquiring cyber insurance and your team to understand what are the top, for example, the top 3 loss scenarios or that really are applicable to your business, and what would those costs be before you have those conversations with your broker and your underwriters. I think that will be it will benefit you greatly in many ways, financially, operationally, and even if an incident occurs, you'll be best positioned to be able to respond to and recover from it.
Thank you. Well, thank you to both of you for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Interconnectivity is definitely the words that I'm going away with today. And also thank you for your patience, because I think I'm much more savvy now about cyber insurance than I certainly was a few days ago before we have our first conversations before this roundtable. And I hope the same goes for our audience today. And thank you so much for being with us. And of course, if you enjoyed this conversation, don't hesitate to share the link with other people and also join our community on LinkedIn. And as you will see, there are many exchanging with experts and a lot of other conversations about trends and threats and solutions going on. But for today, that is it. Thank you again to our 2 panelists, and thanks to the audience for being here.